Our second presentation this afternoon comes from Nico Tyack, Collections Project Manager at Museums and Galleries Edinburgh. And Nico is going to explore how the team there are working to collect community stories. Thanks, Nico.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me okay? I'm guessing you can.
Yes, thanks, Nico.
Great. Okay, hi. So thanks very much for inviting me to come and talk today, and thanks for the Collections Trust for putting on this conference and for turning it around pretty quickly onto Zoom. It's really interesting hearing what everyone's having to say so far today. And I think there's a lot of commonality of themes that are coming through, which is always reassuring to hear. So today, I'm going to talk to you about, well, first of all, my name's Nico Tyack. I was seconded on to manage our Auld, Reekie, Retold project, which you'll hear more about. The project ended last month, so I'm back to my previous role as Collections Information Officer. And apologies for the number of logos on this slide. I feel that various funders will shout at me if they're not on there. So I'm going to talk about the project Auld, Reekie, Retold, and a small part of that's the story catching initiative. The project strapline was new stories of an old city, and I think that kind of reflects in many ways what the theme of the conference is about, is to kind of new stories or new perspectives of collections that we already have. I was going to say collections we know about, but we might not even know about them. We were looking at our collections and audiences and communities, which may be familiar with us, but then, yeah, getting these new perspectives. And before I go any further, I should say, like every single one of you on this in this conference, our plans were completely blindsided by COVID. So we lost 15 months of actually physical inventory work. We had all sorts of intentions of doing lots of really quite cool stuff, and in the end, we didn't quite get as much done as we were hoping. So what am I actually going to do in this talk? I'm going to give you a very brief summary of the Auld, Reekie, Retold project, and then explain a little bit about what story catching actually is. And you'll see how the project is much more than just a straightforward collections review or inventory, and you'll see a little bit more of that in a minute. After that, I'll go into actually how we did it. So you've just seen some key emu screenshots from Sam. I'm afraid I'm going to show you some more key emu screenshots. But it was a fundamental part of the project, so I think I need to get that over and show you that. And then also the impact that it had on project participants. So while we were looking at it as a way of getting information about our collections from external partners, communities, audiences, actually there was a lot of impact that they felt as well, generally good. And I'll finish off with the actual legacy of the project and where we go from here. And actually I've got lots of notes from today to give me a few hints on how to take this forwards. So thanks to all the previous speakers, much appreciated. So what exactly is Auld, Reekie, Retold? I should probably say at this stage, Auld Reekie is an old nickname for Edinburgh. It's Scots for old, and smoky, reference to all the chimneys pouring out smoke. So we deliberately chose quite a local term that people from outside the city might not be familiar with. It's a project that was aimed very much at the city community. The project can be summarized as inventory, document, engage, and stories. So it was, when we set it all up, we wanted to go beyond just a pure inventory of the collections. We felt that in much of what we've been hearing this morning in terms of the slow cataloguing, just a quick kind of rough and ready inventory of what you've got and where it is great, but not actually very valuable in terms of knowing what you can do with that. We might know what's on a shelf, but actually what it means, what the context is that you just don't get that from an inventory. Neither are we at the stage of doing a full collections review in the sense of any sort of rationalization or collections development. This was very much, what do we have, what do we know about it, and what else can we find about it? And this is where the story catching element came in, really, which is it can be summarized as the systematic and structured recording of contributed content from outside the museum environment. Now that sounds really fancy, but it was a fairly straightforward premise that as curators and collection staff, we don't know everything about our collections. It's not our place to know everything about the collections. And there's an awful lot of knowledge out there about our collections, either from people who used objects in our collections, who owned them, who made them, or indeed, in fact, just researchers who have actually spent a lot more time looking into these objects than we have. So when we were planning this collections review, we were very much aware that this was a golden opportunity to share our collections and get information from outside as well. The idea of story catching kind of bridges the gap between the work done by outreach and engagement colleagues and the mission of the collections manager to harness the sort of mess of human experience and to package it into ways that can be retrieved. So we've been talking this morning about, kind of the discovery of information. There was a lovely quote this morning about, how we should be trying to move away from nicely organized data and embracing the mess of kind of human experience. And that's kind of what we've been trying to do, but in a way that we can still actually use that information and it's meaningful for future use. It's very tied to the use of collection spectrums procedure, because in a way, what the story catching is doing is trying to capture the findings from what others have said about our collections during events, during inquiries, and our visits to our collection centre. So it was developed to be mutually beneficial. The City of Edinburgh Council is very much about, has a strategic plan at the moment where it's putting well-being on the citizens of the city very much at the heart of what the council is all about. So we recognise the impact that working hands-on with collection objects can have on people. So we hope that the people who did participate got a sense of having actually kind of really gained from it. So how did we actually do it? We discovered that there's two different ways of doing the story catching. There's the reactive versus proactive, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about that in a minute. But as I said earlier on, this was the biggest element of the project that was hit by COVID. We had aspirations to do all sorts of events and story catching events, getting out and about in the city, working with partners to really co-curate displays and information and kind of recording exercises. But it just didn't happen. We were lucky to get a grant from Museums and Galleries Scotland for a collections engagement officer who worked on the project for 18 months. The application was written in April 2020, so during the first lockdown, on the assumption that foolishly we'd be back in person in no time. So the whole thing was very much done in a lockdown, working from home context, which was difficult, but we still managed to get some really good examples and case studies going. So the main considerations when we're putting together a story catching event is, firstly, who is attending? Who is this for? Is this a case of us reacting to, for example, an external researcher who wants to come and see what we have in our collections for their own purposes, or is it something that's actually coming from us? Do we want it to be quite structured in terms of the objects that we have out, specific questions we want to ask people, or which I think is probably quite dangerous because you don't know what that person's going to know about it, so you can't really have this preconceived idea of questions you want to ask. Same time, just having a kind of free fall discussion where you go into all sorts of wormholes and things can be also quite problematic. So the examples of the reactive story catching, I'm sure you've all had inquiries where you've had someone doing research or community groups who want to come and have a look at something in your collection. And I found it quite consistent that we do this. We get people into our collection centre, they get very excited about the objects they see and they leave. And we're not much the wiser for it. And that's such a lost opportunity. In the past few years, we've had some really great work with people coming in looking at, I've got the examples here, are the clock from the St Giles Kirk up on the High Street and the Town Guard muskets. Now, the Town Guard muskets was a really good example of kind of reactive story catching. There was an expert in early firearms who wanted to come over look at our collection. We knew nothing about it. He spent 3 days and basically downloaded his brain. And the result was an exhibition and the knowledge that actually we have a very significant collection of muskets, which we would not have known at all in any other way. So that's the idea of reactive, is people coming to you saying, I would like to see such and such. The more proactive story catching was very much something that came out of the Auld Reekie Retold project. While we were doing inventory work, we found a lot of objects that we really didn't know anything about, or the curators had really specific questions and issues that they wanted to sort of tease out from wherever they could. So we turned to social media again. Because of COVID, we couldn't do what we had hoped to. So we turned to social media to try and get some of our objects out there and say, basically, if you know about it, get in touch. And we was extremely fortunate. We had a couple of instances where we had a stash of family photos that all came to us in the 70s. And we didn't know anything about them at all, apart from a couple of the names. And we managed to get them out on Facebook and actually got in touch with the descendants of the people in the photos. And this photo here is my colleague Russell, who was the collections engagement officer, working with two ladies who are the descendants of the people in the photos. And they went through it all, and we recorded it. So I'll show you how we did it in another slide, but we recorded it all and we captured all the information, and it's just completely enhanced everything we know about these photographs, and it's given them real meaning. We ran a roadshow style event, one of the council libraries, where we brought some objects relating to that area of town, and what we found was that the attendees didn't actually come with that level of interest. They were just nosy to see stuff, but they didn't necessarily really want to come and share and impart their knowledge. So I think we didn't necessarily sell it very well, and I think people were quite unsure about the format, but we got some good insights. But I think if we were to do it again, we'd be much clearer about the way we would do these events, and be much more upfront about the fact, please come with your stories. The tendency then is people come with their objects they want to donate, and we're always trying to mitigate that from happening as well. So in terms of how we actually recorded all of this, these are screenshots from our KeyEmu collections management system. And you can see that the image there, the photograph, is of a grid of photographs that we used for one particular story catching related to a ceramics workshop in Edinburgh. And we can't quite see it, but there's masking tape along the top and sides with numbers and letters, and we could refer to each individual image. So we could talk about image C3, for example. So we had the whole meeting was recorded on audio and transcribed, and then entered onto EMU. So you can see here, this is just the very basic information about the meeting and the context and why it happened. And within the actual kind of uploaded various bits of multimedia, we've got the photographs, we've got the recording itself, the audio recording, we've got a transcription, word for word transcription of the meeting, and then our curator actually who was there present at the meeting was taking notes as well. So with all of that, we've actually got some really good information, and it's completely raw data. It's not formatted. It's not had any sort of, apart from the transcription side of things, in terms of correcting spelling and what have you. It really is quite raw and still quite messy. But hopefully the idea is it's there to be used by the curators. None of this is intended initially to go public. We don't yet have a public collections portal, but that's where it's going to go eventually, once it's been kind of tweaked and tidied up. And then you can see on the actual object record, the catalogue record, you've got the image of the object on the top right there. And just to sort of flag up that there is other information in, those of you who use EMU might know about the narratives module, which is where we're recording all the story catching bit. And that's all going, and that's being flagged up with a little book icon. So anyone looking at these records internally can see, there's more information about this object, and they'll know where to look. So it's just a little visual flag to actually kind of let people know what's been recorded onto EMU. I should say a tiny little bit, I think I'm running a little bit out of time, but a little bit about how we managed to do story catching during the pandemic. As I say, we turned to social media quite a lot, but we also actually did a paper-based exercise where we printed out some of the images into a folder. And this is, again, Russell, who went down to a local history group down in New Haven, part of Edinburgh. And it was all very COVID safe, and people were invited to make notes on the paper, but leave 72 hours in between handling the papers around and so on. And it worked really well. It was a complete experiment, but the people who were doing the story catching participants were actually older folk who actually wouldn't have wanted to have done it online anyway. So actually this worked really very well for them. In terms of the impact on participants, it was really interesting to see people just really welcomed the chance to look at these objects. You know, a lot of it was very close to their own history. We actually saw the lady who hand painted this dish from the Buchan's pottery came to talk to us about the whole process, and they got quite emotional. It was much more than reminiscence. You know, there wasn't. It was very spontaneous, and they wanted to impart. You know, we explained to them why we were doing this. It was to kind of download their knowledge, if you like. So they were really keen to impart their knowledge, and I think they got a lot out of that, and sharing and explaining and correcting. You know, because we showed them our records, and no, that's wrong. You got this wrong in your records. That's wrong. This wrong. This is right. Which again was just so helpful, and it gave them a real sense of having kind of contributed to, you know, their heritage living on in the museum collections. The legacy of the project. So as I said, the project finished just in September, and we're doing a end of project exhibition that's opening in December. So I'm kind of in the midst of that at the moment, trying to sort of figure out the exhibition side of things. But a lot of the story catching will feature in the exhibition. I haven't yet had a chance to really kind of sum up a lot of the project. There's been quite a lot of talk this morning about precisely that. We do a lot of work in gathering and working with groups, but we don't necessarily give time for the follow-up, mopping up, and actually putting in place the actual kind of lasting work in that. But I'm working on clearing up our EMI records based on the story catching, and embedding a procedure. I think a lot of the curators have actually seen that the value of story catching, and actually really bedding that down into our cataloguing process, and accepting that there is no such thing as a finished record, and that we can always add to it. And whenever we do community exhibitions, community outreach work, a key part of that is actually getting that information into object records. So it's actually just keeping that information. It's not just, you know, that the project itself isn't a very short-term thing with few kind of lasting legacies. So that's where we're at. I think I've learned a lot of things from what everyone's been saying today. So I'll be able to report back on how it's going if anyone's interested. So thanks very much, and I'll hand it back over to Sarah.